Hello, welcome to our lunch break study. It is Wednesday, December 8th, 2021. We have an abbreviated lunch break study today. We're going to go for a half an hour because my wife is out of town and my children have an early get out from school. And so I have to pick them up at 12:50. So we're going to go for halftime, but I have an interesting topic that I would like to get into. I was thinking about, did I want to take time debriefing some of the previous sessions? If anybody has any comments, I can take some time debriefing some of the previous sessions. But what I wanted to do is take the time to go a little bit into our Torah portion today, which deals with some of the theological issues that I think we've been talking about over the past, I don't know, couple of years. So first of all, takeaway from any of the previous conversations that we've had, any topics that people would like to get into? I just wanted to open it up and just take the temperature here to see if there was any feedback, or I can just keep moving along, but I always want to give the opportunity for feedback. All right, so let's take the time here. We have a half an hour and I want to teach something. So I'm going to go and start teaching it, and let me show you what it is. So it comes from 1971, from Christmas Day, 1971, 50 years ago. And it is from Rabbi Norman Lamb, who was the president, the head of Yeshiva University, and it concerns this week's Torah portion. And in this week's Torah portion, there always seems to be one key issue that I think is very relevant, which is, very theologically significant, which is when at the very end of the Torah portion, well, not at the very end of the Torah portion, but pretty much at the climax of the Joseph narrative, he reveals himself to his brothers who had sold him into slavery. And he says famously to his brothers, "Don't feel bad. You didn't do this. You weren't in control. This was God who put me here." And so that raises some questions about free will, about forgiveness, and about what it is that we do in this world. Is God predetermined everything from the get-go? So therefore, Joseph had to endure that traumatic experience of being tossed into a pit, or was there his own volition at hand there? And what does that mean, and how do we understand that? And so there's a wonderful Devar Torah that I just wanted to do in the brief halftime period that we have today. And so he says here, the change of the natural seasons often induces a retrospective mood in people, right? We get to the end of the year, we like to share best of lists. I always like to, what was the best album, best movie, best book you read this year? Therefore, at this time of the year, when we've just ushered autumn out and winter in, we tend to look back on the past and contemplate our lives. We survey where we are, what has happened to us. We wonder, could I have done things differently? And if I had, would it have made a difference? Sometimes we see ourselves as a product of all of our past decisions. We recognize that our failures and our successes are the results of specific actions that we have taken or that we have failed to undertake. Just think about your own lives. Think about all the different pivot points that you made in your lives, the jobs that you took, or where you decided to move. And Rabbi Lamb says, as a result, we feel satisfied or dissatisfied, as the case may be, because we recognize that we were ourselves responsible for what we have done and what we have become. At other times, we tend to feel that the facts of life are so insurmountable, the direction of events are so inelucutable, the tide of life so irreversible that we are what we are almost despite ourselves, and that we have very little to say about it. No matter what we did or did not do in the past, we would be in approximately the same position, right? So two ideas. And so in asking such questions, we confront the great problems of life. You know me, I always like to talk about the great problems of life on our Wednesday study session, which has been the concern of philosophers and theologians and ordinary people like ourselves from the days of antiquity down to our own times. So secular thinkers often view this question through the course of the interpretation of history. There are many who are determinists. determinists, he says, such as Marx, who believe that we are propelled by a massive impersonal force of history and that individual men and women have little influence on the course of events. Others, however, believe that individual men play crucial roles, and women, at specific points in history. We know, for instance, of the theory of Carlyle, who believes that heroes or outstanding men and women are the ones who, by the force of their personality, determine the direction of events. Several years ago, Professor Oscar Handlin wrote a book in which he discusses 8 turning points in American history, and in each of these stations, a different decision can be made from different distinct Americans, whether it's Benjamin Barondess, the writing of Abraham Lincoln, maintains that different decisions by Lincoln at certain specific points in his career would have changed the face of American society forever. And so there is no such thing, this is, I guess, Barondess, there's no such thing as history, there is only his or her story. An act is without significance unless we know the actor. So in other words, history is your story and my story and his story. It's the unfolding events initiated and changed by individual minds and personalities. To which of these opinions do the Jewish sources subscribe to? Let me ask you before he gets to answer. By the way, that's always what any good clergy would do, is ask and answer a question. If you're not asking and answering a question, you're not really giving a sermon. Marv.
Going back to the Torah portion.
Well, he'll get there. He will get there, I promise you.
Yeah, of course, Joseph says a few times that God has directed him, but Judah never says that. And I wonder why Judah got the prize. And I think it's because, he must have read Deuteronomy beforehand, because presented to him were blessings and curses, and he chose the blessing. So I think determinism certainly applies to much of Genesis, if not everything. But I think Judah, of course, exercised his free will.
So I love Marv. Marv gives me the quintessential Jewish answer, which is yes and both and no and not at all, which is perfect. Yes, the answer is yes. They're both in the Torah. In fact, Marv is going to point out some of what Rabbi Lamb is going to point out is when the Torah disagrees with itself or is seemingly contradictory, which is how can it say, if you do certain things, I'll make the rains fall, and then other times say, well, Joseph, you don't have to worry about throwing me into a pit because you weren't in control of that. Seems to be contradictory. So other thoughts? All right, so let's go back here. Let's see what he says here. For one thing, mainstream Judaism does not consider blind fate, impersonal and uncontrollable forces as dominating events. Okay, so blind fate, we don't consider to be dominating events. Judaism objected to Greek fatalism and modern determinism as well. So the question in Judaism, as he frames it, is not between fate and choice, but between destiny. I'm not sure. We can question his use of these terms here, whether or not it works, but now he's going to say it's not between fate and choice, but between destiny and human initiative. All right, that seems like semantics to me a little bit, but that's okay. We'll go on. Generally, we may trace the two opinions in Judaism to two root theories. All right, this is interesting. One is called quietism, and that is the belief that human beings attain their fullest spiritual development when they acknowledge that we are fundamentally nothing in the presence of God. And when we suppress our desire and the desire to impose our will and assert our ego, all right? The highest act of man, according to this quietism, is to convert his ani to Ain, which I like, right? I like to say, be like Ain. To convert his I to Ain, which means nothing, right? His self or his ego into nothingness. Therefore, man or human beings must not make any attempt to interfere in the historical process, because that would be an act of arrogance and presumptuousness against God. And in effect, any such effort is doomed to failure and taken to this extreme, this becomes the ideology of Neturei Karta, which Rabbi Lam says here is the position that we can't be Zionists because, well, who are we? We shouldn't impose that upon the world. We have to wait for God to bring about a Jewish state. So we're going to be quiet. We're not going to be presumptuous. And we're going to wait for God to come along before we establish a homeland. That's quietism. And Rabbi Lam uses Neturei Karta as the example. The second school is that of activism. The belief that human beings are created in the image of God must exercise their freedom, their initiative, and that in doing so, that is the following of the will of God. That the will of God is to be found in our exercising our unique initiative or will or whatever that might be. Now, both schools, as Marv already pointed out, can point to sources in the Jewish tradition. Marv just pointed to both of them. Quietism can cite support in the fact that Abraham was told in advance that his children would go into exile and that later they would be redeemed, right? So Abraham in the Brit and the covenant is told, you're going to be children are going to be as numerous as the sands in the sea, the stars in the sky, but they're going to spend hundreds of years enslaved. So he's told this at the outset in Genesis 15. Apparently, Rabbi Lam says the divine will worked independently of what individual humans wanted or wanted not to do. So according to the covenant, Abraham's descendants were going to be enslaved. It didn't really matter what Joseph does in this Torah portion, perhaps, because God had already predetermined that your progeny is going to be enslaved. And then after that, they're going to come out of that and be as numerous as the stars in the sky. So that would be the argument that says for the quietist approach. All right. And the rabbis, it says here, were even known to make a statement as broad as comprehensive as this: Hakol talui b'mazel ve'afilu sefer Torah shebehuchal. Everything depends on luck. Everything depends on luck. Hakol talui b'mazel, afilu, even the very scroll, the Torah in the Ark. That basically we have to depend on luck. And we know, like, for example, Jerry Newhouse survived the Holocaust and took the Torah out of Germany. And probably, was that luck that allowed us to have the Torah in our Ark here? Was that activism? Activism has an even broader range of support. The whole concept of reward and punishment, this is what Marv was saying in Deuteronomy, symbolized and expressed in V'haya im Shemoah, in the paragraphs of the Shema, the second paragraph of the Shema, is based on the idea that human beings determine and that we're responsible for our own actions. Those who do not return to Zion with Ezra are blamed for their recalcitrance. Rabbi Akiva supported Bar Kokhba. Rabbi Ishmael interpreted the words of the Torah, V'rapeh Yerapeh, that we shall heal, that we shall give healing, right? We should say, oh, people are sick, we shouldn't heal the person. No, one must not feel that interfering medically is the course of a disease is acting in the presumption of the divine will, right? You could take it out to that logical extreme. Well, someone's sick, but I'm not going to be presumptuous and try to heal them. But of course, we don't take that position. And the Ramban, himself a physician, maintains that it is not only a privilege, but a commandment to interfere and impose our desire for health upon a naturally discerning. We have to stop. We have a pandemic. We have to do something. We're not just going to let the pandemic ravage. We're going to do something about it. And the rabbis would also say that one who did not prepare before Shabbos does not deserve to eat on Shabbos. Or man works with his hands and the Holy One blesses the works of his hands. All right, so basically we've got a multiplicity of sources on this. So Rabbi Lam says, if we have two opposing views within the context of Judaism, what do we do today? How can we interpret the world? This is 1971 here. How can we determine the world? And even more important, our own individual lives. So he says, here we go, Marv. Now he's going to get to the Parsha. If we turn to the Sidra this morning, we find paradoxically that both principles are contained within one narrative, and that of the meeting of Joseph and his brothers. In the beginning, Joseph has yet to reveal himself. This is what Marv was talking about with Judah and the others. And we find Judah this is a real act of volition. Certainly that seems to be the test that Joseph has set up, that Judah passes. We find Judah making his great plea in his confrontation with Joseph, demanding Benjamin be released. Often we wonder, why did Joseph make his brothers go through this agony, going back and forth, threatening to take Shimeon and then Benjamin? Can any sin by the brothers against Joseph justify this apparently calm and premeditated sadism? Wow. Rabbi Lamb says it was sadistic, this back and forth. The answer, of course, is that there is no sadism whatsoever intended by Joseph because he was righteous. What Joseph is doing then, because the rabbi says it can't be sadistic, is simply and logically enough letting Judah and the brothers through the paces of the process called teshuvah, or repentance. He wants to put them in the position where, once again, where they have to choose the choice between accepting or abdicating responsibility for their younger brother. In this case, it's Benjamin. When we find Judah and Joseph opposite each other at the beginning of the Sidra, that's precisely the position that Judah is in. He comes through with flying colors, as Marv said. So that same Judah who seemed to be concerned only with the price he could get from Joseph earlier has changed. He's different than when he threw his brother and said, what are we going to get for his brother's life? Now he's willing to give up his own life. He's in the same situation, but he's doing it completely differently. And that's basically what Rabbi Lamb is saying. This isn't sadism. No, this is the very fact that Joseph just wanted to give Judah the opportunity to atone for his sin. And no matter what subsequent developments were, Judah must be responsible for his original act. All right, so you agree? You think you buy that? Anyone buy that? He's not sadistic. He's not getting back at his brothers. He's just giving them the opportunity to do teshuvah. Isn't that lovely? Anybody? Nobody. Okay. I'm being a little cheeky, but that's fine. It is very fake. Yeah, Judah.
I'm just saying, where is the tomorrow story? Is that before this or after this?
So tomorrow's story, it's on a cliffhanger. It's a cliffhanger. It
No, but
ended
the truth-
last week. It ended last week with this cliffhanger with Judah has to step forward to save his
Yeah.
brothers.
So, I mean, that's what my point is, that Judah does step forward.
That's
He
right.
does take responsibility.
That's
So
right.
that's why I'm asking where it is in the timeline, because what you just said about Judah is that, you know, he has taken responsibility here. Did he
Bingo.
learn that?
So
from
it's
tomorrow,
before he revealed. Thank you. It's before Joseph reveals himself. He waits, just like you said, for Judah to do this teshuvah, to show him that his brothers weren't the same that they were. They've changed. Once Judah comes forward at the beginning of this week's parsha, that's when Joseph says, "Hey, it's me. Is my father still alive?" Marv.
You know, to me, it looks like the story has been told to be sure that Judah comes out looking like a rose. And I guess if we look at the history of Judaism, I mean, we are called Jews, of course, from Judah, perhaps, Yehudim. But if we look through history, continually in the storyline, Judah comes out on top. It's as if the story were written at a later time and inserted.
Maybe by the Judeans, maybe even by the Judeans in the area of the land referred to as Judea, perhaps.
Well, there was conflict between the southern Judah and the northern territory of Joseph, Ephraim. And in the political struggle, it seems like this story would be wonderful to promote Judah. And of course, Judah gets the prize by being the line of the Messiah. And what better story than the Joseph story, where you get 4 parsha devoted to Joseph, and Judah becomes king and Joseph stays as the viceroy. I
But
mean,
the
it's
rabbis,
very, it's
the rabbis were
ironic.
never, but the rabbis were never going to answer that question with the answer, well, this is because the victors write the history, right? That was not, the rabbis weren't going to read the Parsha and say that. They had to come up with the theological insight that it was about how does one do teshuvah, which is, if you're the famous Rambam interpretation, you have to be in the same exact, he actually is going to share it here, right? So yet immediately thereafter, when Joseph reveals himself, okay, so here it is, right? You have to be in the same situation. That's the Maimonides. You do teshuvah. Once he's done teshuvah, he reveals himself immediately thereafter. When Joseph reveals himself, and his brothers are aghast, they're shocked. Judah's just done this teshuvah. He reveals himself. Joseph at once, after being perhaps sadistic, proceeds to lift from them the burden of responsibility and gift. And he says, "Va'ata." Right? Al ta'atzuvu. Do not be upset and angry with yourselves that you sold me here, because it is the Lord who sent me here in order to provide for you and the entire family. Rabbi Lamb said, what Joseph appears to be saying is that both opposite ideas are true simultaneously. The brothers are responsible, and yet they're not the only actors. Joseph in his speech uses two key verbs. He uses the word machor, which means to sell, and 3 times the word shalach, to send. It is as if he is saying to his brothers, from one point of view, you are guilty because you perpetuated the act of selling your brother down the river. So you must be held responsible for this act, and you have every reason to feel guilty and contrite. Yet at the same time, you are only pawns in the larger drama of the destiny of the people of Israel, for it is God who sent me here through you. You were merely performing an act determined by God, who is ultimately responsible. So it is both human initiative and divine destiny that converge and act in parallel, in simultaneous form. I can tell you that this would have failed a philosophy exam in undergrad. This would not have been an appropriate philosophically. He seems like, to me, like he's having his cake and eating it too, and I get a little lost. But does anyone follow him better than me here? Because it seems like your brothers, you did this and you need to be responsible for it, but God basically had the plan and you're just a pawn of God. And therefore, in Lamb's estimation, it's both human initiative and divine decreed destiny that converge and enact in parallel and simultaneous form. It doesn't make philosophical sense, but maybe it makes spiritual sense. Don.
Yeah, the divine plan. So you do something wrong, that's on you, but there's the divine plan, like you said, that's making you do it. And I just want to change the divine plan maybe to that you do what you do, you are totally responsible for it. And instead of divine plan, you have the love of God. There was no divine plan by God. You do what you do, and God will love you at the same time.
Well, so that's definitely not Lamb's theology. That is a way more liberal theology than the one that the Orthodox community is going to be comfortable with. And I think that's why sometimes you see a very zealous group like the Netori Karta not be active, where you have the reform movement doing tikkun olam because they feel that they have to get out and repair the world. So there is that interesting dichotomy between this activism and perhaps observance. But then, of course, that's completely flipped when it comes to the Chabadniks, who are not sitting and waiting for the Mashiach to come, but they are very active trying to bring about the Messiah. Let me go on here. We find Midrash gives us a similar insight in an ironical and charming manner. All right, let's see if this Midrash works for us and how these two levels work out together. The Midrash is commenting on a verse from Isaiah that says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts." How so? So here's the Midrash answers. The sons of Jacob were busy with the selling of Joseph. Jacob, our father, was mourning and grieving for his lost son, Judah was busy finding himself a wife. And also the Holy One, as it were, was preoccupied. He was busy creating the light of the Messiah, the descendants of the match between Judah and Tamar. And the Messiah could never have come unless these individual acts took place separately and in apparently self-contained manner. Each scene in the drama does indeed seem to be self-contained. Each man acts responsively, and that God stands above it all and weaves all the various strands together, resulting in the tapestry that presents a picture of totally different dimensions. It's very hard for the human to conceptualize this. It almost seems beyond our ability to imagine. It's like one of those impressionistic paintings when you get too close, right? All you see are the dots, and then you pull out and the picture becomes clear. There seems to be a desire in the Midrash and Rabbi Lamb's case to say that each of us are deciding based upon individual choices or volitions. But if you pull out and can see through the mind of God, then you will understand why we are the way we are. But I'm not sure that Don isn't going to be super comfortable with that. What about anybody else here? Okay, not super comfortable with that. That's understandable. All right, so let's go on here. We may then assume that Judaism teaches that both of these elements are always present. We never have the right to dismiss either the role of God or the role of man. It becomes a matter of emphasis, right? So Reform will emphasize tikkun olam, right? Some will emphasize faith, some human initiative. Here's Rabbi Luzzatto talked about histadlut and bitachon. Those are the differences between faith and action. We find the same tendency in Talmudic literature. So Rava says, in a brooding contemplation of the different fortunes that befall two great teachers that are alike in saintliness, Rava says that life and health, chai, bani, umazoni, children, life and health, children and how they turn out and whether they give us nachas and sustenance and wealth, these are matters which depend upon luck. And yet one of the great medieval scholars, the Meiri, refuses to accept this Talmudic dictum as binding and authoritative. He says, pay no attention to Luzzatto. He says he's only a minority or opinion, and he cannot reverse the sanction of religion under any circumstances. Rava will place more emphasis on divine destiny. Meiri declares that's un-Jewish, this concept of beshert, right? We've heard that, beshert, and prefers to maximize the human role. But whichever opinion, we feel more constrained to accept, both elements must be present. All right, so I'm sort of out of time at the moment here, but let me give you the rest of the document so that you can finish it. Hold on. Put it in the chat here. This is always, I think, one of the most interesting topics. I'm sorry that I have to go pick up the kids. It's one of the most interesting topics to me because I think you could divide up the Jewish world totally differently if you were to divide it up based upon quietism and activism. I actually think it's more fascinating if we were to divide up Jewish denominations along those lines, because you would place the Chabadniks and the Reformniks on the same side, saying we're not going to be quiet. Our faith is active. So that's a fascinating reshuffling. And then the modern Orthodox and the Turei Karta would be on the quietist side to a certain extent. And then there would be us. And so that's how it would end with you. Where in the world do we fit on that spectrum? Probably down the middle somewhere. I would say like Rabbi Gilman used to say, on some days we've got to go out and fix the world because it's totally broken and somebody's got to do it. And then on other days we need to wait for God. God should come first before we do it. I think there's danger of doing both. There's certainly a danger of doing nothing. That's just obvious to me. You have to act. You can't stay in bed. You've got to get out and repair the world and do mitzvahs. It's just ridiculous to stay at home. And but at the other hand, you can take it too far. You can definitely take it too far and think you're doing God's work and you're certain of the God's work, and you're just going to impose that upon everything without any sort of sense of humility and discernment. That maybe I need to understand that I'm not God, and that I need to have a little bit more patience and humility. And I think, I'd like to tell my kids the golden mean is there somewhere. And so obviously as a conservative rabbi, that's what I shoot for. Anyway, speaking of my kids, I'm going to go pick them up. I will see everybody here again next Wednesday, and I look forward to it. All right. Take care, everybody. So long. I'll check Judah. Take care.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.